Hi again, and welcome into the lesson number 6, called When and How to Move Your Pawns. In the previous lessons, we analyzed some typical pawn structures in the middle game, such as doubled pawns or isolated pawns. Perhaps you have noticed that in some situations, your pawns can be the power of your positions, and in other situations it can be rather a weakness. Therefore, this is a bit of a tricky topic and you have to be very accurate here. Maybe you faced sometimes the situations where you played against a much higher rated opponent, maybe a title player, and you noticed that you lost the game just because of your own mistakes. What I mean is, it was not that your opponent really played some brilliant moves, it was rather you making some mistakes which weakened your position and your opponent just took advantage of that fact. Did you ever face such situations? Well, I'm seeing such cases very often when I just analyze the games of the students. That's why I'd like to warn you against such cases and to show you exactly how to make sure that your position is always sound and that whenever you play active moves, you make sure that you don't lose something and that you don't weaken something. Now let's go to the specific examples and let's go and see how you can master the pawn play and how you can do it perfectly in the right manner and in the right time. Let's start from the very basic example, and then we'll see how these general strategies work in more complex situations. For example, white starts by advancing his e-pawn, and then after knight f6, white pushes his pawn forward to the 5th rank. Now let's just talk about this position. Let's analyze what happened after white advanced his pawn to the 5th rank. Some good things happened for white. For example, in the following moves, most likely both players will strive to develop his pieces in the central squares. So if you look at the black's position, now it's somewhat limited by the white's e5 pawn. Most likely black will be able to develop his pieces only within the last 3 ranks of his position. While at the same time, if you look at the white's position, he will be able to take advantage of the larger territory, and at least he'll be able to control the 4 ranks. Maybe even white will be able to control the 5th rank. So white controls more space, which will enable his larger activity of his pieces. And that's something definitely good for white. On the other hand, there are some drawbacks of this advancement. For example, the e5 pawn became very close to black's pieces, and therefore black can attack this pawn very easily. For example, black can play knight c6 at some point and attack this pawn right away. If you compare the e5 pawn with the rest of the white's pawns, you can see that this advanced pawn is in a much bigger danger when compared to all the other pawns. This is one of the disadvantages of advancing your pawns. There is one more drawback of such an advancement. If we have a look once again at the earlier position, you'll notice that the e4 pawn was controlling some central squares, f5 and d5 squares. Now, once the pawn advances, it loses the control over those squares. And now black can easily occupy those squares around this pawn, like d5, f5, and even e4, so those squares which the e5 pawn can no longer control. And another bad thing for white is that the pawns cannot go back, so the situation will be like that for the rest of the game. And that's why you should be extremely cautious while moving your pawns, because you cannot correct the situation anymore. To conclude, when you advance your any pawn, you gain some more space and eventually you gain more activity for your pieces, but at the same time, this pawn may become a target for an attack for your opponent, and your opponent may take advantage of the weak squares around and behind that pawn. That's why you need to know very well when should you move a pawn and when you should not do that. Of course, I'm talking not only about the e-pawn, this is the general rule which is applicable for any pawn for any positions. Here's a game between two former world champions. A white player is Maslov and black player is Karpov. This is white to move at the moment. he has the isolated pawn, the situation that we were discussing in the previous lesson, and right now white has a powerful way to take advantage of this pawn. Can you see it? Yeah, white can just push the pawn forward, taking advantage of the pin along the e-file. Therefore, black can't really capture the pawn, because in that case, white will checkmate black, and the game is over. Therefore, after d5, black has to retreat with his knight, which is currently attacked. Black played knight d8, and white just pushed the pawn forward. Now, so we have the situation here where white started to advance his pawn forward. And there are some really good things for white which this advancement provided. The one thing is that by now white has a very clear plan for the following moves. White can just keep pushing this pawn forward. For instance, in the next move, it's very likely that white will just play d7. And white will have to think how to remove the blockading pieces in front of that pawn and simply how to move it forward and to promote it. That's a great thing for you, because in that case you don't have to think very hard about your plan, and you just try to make use of your passed pawn. Well, let's see what happened in the game. Black played rook c5, and pushed the pawn forward really. Black played rook e7. Now there is another very important aspect that you may notice. When you have the passed pawn, your opponent has to blockade it, and he has to use his piece to blockade your pawn. And therefore, an opponent's piece is somewhat very much restricted and is just out of game. So black cannot use his knight anymore. The only thing that the knight can do is just to stand there on d8 and do nothing. That's another big advantage of advancing your passed pawns. White played queen f4. He's going to go with queen b8 on the next move to attack that blockader knight. Black played bishop g7, and white really realized his threat. He played queen b8. By the way, another important thing to notice here is that thanks to the d7 pawn, white gained more space. For example, white's rook can now go to the d6, white queen can go all the way up to the 8th rank. So this pawn provides the great space advantage for white, while the black's rook and the knight are doomed to stand there in the last ranks and do nothing. I just played queen b8, and here already the game is almost over. Black cannot stop this pawn. For instance, here white can just remove the queen with a tempo and promote another queen, and now white is a piece up and black resigns soon. In this game, the advancement of the white's pawn was a very powerful thing, and that was the main reason for the white's easy victory. Now let's come back to the starting position of that example where white started that advancement forward. And let's think why it was so much successful for white. And it happened because this pawn and its advancement forward was supported by almost all of the white's pieces. If you look at the white's pieces, then all of them are focused on the central lines, and they all are supporting this pawn advancement. The knight is also looking towards the central squares. And that's why it was so easy for white to push it forward, and there was nothing that black can do about the pawn. So here it was a very good example of the situations when you should be advancing your pawns, when you have very good control with your pieces over the squares where you are going to advance the pawn. In such a way, you can get tremendous advantage in many different factors, like you can gain more space, your opponent will have to use one of his pieces to blockade a pawn, and you have a simple plan of just advancing your pawns forward. Here's another game between the white player Neith and black Corning Peter. I don't know these players, maybe they are non-title players, but anyway, the position is quite instructive. It is white to move, and what do you think about this position in general? Like, who is better at the moment? And in particular, what do you think about the black's pawn on d4? Like, is it an advantage of black's position, or maybe there is something wrong with it? So what do you think? Well, on one hand, we may say that this is the only pawn which is currently presented in the center, therefore it provides better control over central squares for black, which is something good for black. Also, it helps black to control larger space, which is also something nice, but there is one fatal flaw. Currently, white is ahead in development. He has already developed all of his pieces while black still has his light-squared bishop undeveloped. And it is white to move at the moment, and therefore he can start to play some moves to attack that pawn. For instance, he can play rook d1, or in the game he played e3, making use of the pin along the d-file. And once the pawn was attacked, black had to do something about that. He pushed it forward, but now the situation gets even worse for black, because the pawn is getting further from the black's pieces and closer to white's pieces. Therefore, it will be very easy for white to attack this pawn, which is exactly what happened in the next moves. White just played rook d1, taking the pawn. Black replied symmetrically with rook d8, and white continued in a very straightforward manner, knight e1, taking the pawn, and already there is no way for black to protect it. Like if black tries to play bishop f5 supporting the pawn, white can just play e4 to push the bishop away, and then he'll be able to capture that pawn very easily. In the actual game, instead of bishop f5, black played bishop g4, but it didn't help because, well, certainly white could just protect his rook, but instead he has a more powerful way. Do you see the white's maneuver? White can use a counter blow, a very powerful motif which happens very often during the chess games. White played queen c3, threatening checkmate on the g7 square, and at the same time preparing to capture the black's advanced pawn on d3, which has actually happened here. White played rook d3, so he won this pawn, got the material advantage, and won the game later on. Now in this position, if we come back to the starting position of this example, you may notice that the d4 pawn turned out to be a big weakness of the black's position, and black even lost the game just because of that too much advanced pawn. This happened due to the fact that white was ahead in development, and therefore white could start attacking this pawn with his pieces, while black could not provide enough support for that pawn from the side of black's pieces. Here's the game between Winter and Alekhin. It is white to play, and I would like to offer you to think here and to tell me how would you play here as white. You may like to pause the video, think about that for a minute, and then you'll resume the video. In the actual game, white played f4. Probably he's going to start attacking black's pawns by pushing the pawn forward to f5. What do you think about this advancement of the white pawn? Is it good for white or bad or unclear? Well, we'll find out. Let's see what happened next. Black played queen g4 to prevent white from playing f5. White played h3, kicking black's queen away. Then he played rook f1, trying to support that advancement, but black found an interesting way to stop it. He played h5, threatening to advance this pawn forward and to deflect white's knight from supporting the f-pawn advancement. And by the way, this g3 knight has no good squares to retreat. It can only retreat currently to h1, to the corner of the board. And therefore white played knight g1 to vacate another square for the knight. Black played knight f5. White replied with knight f3. Now he's intending to jump with his knight to e5, to the very strong central square. However, it's not going to happen because black can cover this square by his f-pawn. He just played f6. And now you can see the big difference in the pawn structure of white and black. When white was going to jump to the e5 square, black could very easily protect it and cover the square by his pawn. And now white's active play in the center is over, he cannot use the central squares anymore. At the same time, if we look at the symmetric weak square of white at the e4 square, this square cannot be covered by white pawns anymore, because the f4 pawn is already too much far advanced. So white cannot have the f3 pawn, which would eventually cover this square. And since pawns cannot go back, there is no way for white to fix this situation. Okay, let's see what happened next. White played knight h2, black played rook e8, starting to take advantage of the weaknesses along the e-file. By the way, you can see that right now the e3 bishop is weak, and this happens because there is no f2 pawn which would possibly support that bishop. Now the pawn is on 4, so the e3 square is weak, and black starts to take advantage of those weaknesses. Then black doubled rooks along the e-file, and then he decided to triple his heavy pieces. Played queen f3, knight a5. Well, the game was not free of mistakes, but anyway, it's not so critical for us at the moment. We are just looking at the overall scenario of the whole game. Black played knight c4 anyway, because white cannot take the knight. In that case, black would just go for the direct attack of white's king, and the king will be checkmated very soon. Therefore, white cannot capture the knight, he has to do something else. So let's go back to the actual game. Here white played, instead of taking the knight, he played bishop c1, and black invaded through that e3 square, which was weakened by white when he pushed his f pawn forward. Now finally black could invade into white's territory through this e3 square. And all of a sudden white's position became hopeless. Now black is going to play queen d3. Oops, sorry. So here black is going to play queen d3, attacking the white's king and also the knight on e2. At the same time, the knight cannot really go back and retreat somewhere because it has to also protect the weakness on c3 and in some variations on f4, and white's position just collapses, so he lost the game very soon. As you can see, white lost the game, which originally was very much equal, just because he weakened his position by himself. So now there is no way for white to cover those weaknesses square, those weak square e4 and e3, and black could invade into white's territory and start his decisive attack. At the same time, if you look at the original situation, which we happened at the beginning of this example, the position was very symmetric, very equal, there was nothing bad for white here. But because white tried to be active and tried to attack something, he started to push his pawn forward, hoping for an attack, but it backfired. The attack didn't happen, and instead it allowed black to attack white's weaknesses, the weak e4 square and the weak e3 square, those weaknesses which could not be covered by white's pawn anymore. So that's a very typical scenario for the game actually, when you try to be active, you try to go forward, but as a result you weaken your position and it backfires, you lose the game in the end. That's why I'd like to warn you against such things. I've seen such games with a similar scenario very, very often, and that's why I'd like to warn you against that. So let's just look at the starting position once again and think what white should have done here. As you already know, before advancing your pawn, you need to make sure that your pieces can provide enough support for this pawn. Therefore, you need to compare an activity of your pieces and opponent's pieces on this area of the board where you're going to move your pawn. And in the current position, we can see that white's pieces are not active at all. Like the g3 knight is restricted by black's pawns, it cannot go forward at all. The e3 bishop is restricted by white's own pawns on f2 and d4, so the bishop is like a tall pawn. The e2 knight also has no forward squares to go to currently. The white's rooks are kind of passive, they are not doing anything. Therefore, if you look at the white's position, pretty much all of his pieces are not on the ideal positions, they are misplaced. And so what white should have done is just to care about his pieces, to think how to rearrange them, how to make them more active. Like there are a couple of obvious ideas about that. For instance, white could simply move his rook to the open file, like play rook e1. This is one of the easy ways to improve the situation for white. Another idea could be to play his queen to d2, preparing an exchange of his bad bishop, to play bishop f4 and trade off the bishops. And in either case, white needs to move his piece and improve its activity. And then the situation remains to be approximately equal, and most likely it's going to be a draw in the end. Here you need to make a very important conclusion for yourself. Whenever you have a doubt of whether to move a piece or a pawn, in most of the cases you should move a piece. First of all, pieces are more powerful than pawns, and therefore it will improve your position more significantly. And at the same time, while moving a piece, you will improve your activity, make your position more powerful, and prepare advancement of your pawns on the following moves. So if you move a piece now and then start moving your pawns, then this advancement of your pawn will be more secure. It will be well supported by your pieces, and there will be no danger for you. In the current position, White did not realize this rule. He tried to be active. He played a seemingly active move f4, which backfired, and he lost the game badly. So this f4 move turned out to be a decisive mistake, and he lost the game because of his seemingly active intentions. Conclusions. When you advance your pawns forward, there are some good things for you. Firstly, if you have a strong passed pawn, it gives you a simple and clear plan to advance it forward. Secondly, when you advance your pawns forward, you gain more space, and therefore you ensure higher activity of your pieces. At the same time, you limit the activity and the available space of your opponent's pieces. Thirdly, your opponent has to use one of his pieces to blockade your pawn, and this helps you to somewhat cut off this piece from the actual game. At the same time, when you advance your pawns, there are some drawbacks. Firstly, this pawn can become weak. When your pawn goes forward, it approaches your opponent's position, and it gets easier for your opponent to attack this pawn. Secondly, the squares around and behind the pawn become weak. Therefore, your opponent might be able to place his pieces on those weaknesses. Lastly, whenever you move a pawn, this is a one-way ticket. You have no way back. So if you weaken your position and later on you find out that there is something wrong, you will be unable to fix the situation anymore. Therefore, it could become a decisive, fatal mistake. That's why before moving a pawn, you need to think twice and make sure that this is the right moment and the right plan. Now, what should you do about this whole stuff? Well, there are two practical rules that you need to always keep in mind while playing. The first thing is that whenever you move a pawn, before that, evaluate activity of the pieces. You need to make sure that your activity is at least equal to opponent's activity on this area of the board where you plan to move your pawn. Otherwise, the pawn will become a weakness, not your strength. Secondly, whenever you have a doubt or a choice between moving a piece and a pawn, move a piece. In the very most of the cases, this will be the right choice. Also, while moving a piece, you prepare advancement of your pawn in the future, because then it will be well supported by the pieces and it will become a power of your position. Congratulations for learning these new ideas. When they are explained, they may seem easy for you, but we have just analyzed the examples of games of grandmasters and high-rated players, and you see that they failed to follow these rules accordingly, and they lost the games because of that. And I think this is one of the really critical moments, because very often I notice that people try to play actively, they move their pawns forward, and their more experienced opponents just take advantage of that and win the games. That's why I really wanted to share this information with you, so that you can remember these ideas, keep them in mind while playing, and make sure that you don't make these mistakes yourself. And whenever your opponent does something seemingly equal and tries to just somehow move forward, expand, and gain more space, you always know that there is some drawback there, and you may attack and take advantage of that. Once again, congratulations, thanks for watching this lesson, and I look forward to talk to you soon.